So when I was probably a junior or senior in high school, I decided that I was going to take up juggling so that I could impress the ladies. Not the best plan in hindsight. Also, the class at the library was free, so what did I have to lose? They started us off very simply. Just get used to the weight of one ball, toss it up and down. Get used to how it feels in your hand, toss it back and forth. Start to get things a little more complicated, get used to that basic juggling move of tossing and catching at the same time so you have the second ball in. But that's kind of boring and unimpressive. You finally get to ball number 3, and now here's the tricky part. You got to keep them all moving long enough for juggling to really be impressive. I actually did that in the first service. But that's about as good as I ever got with juggling. In 20 years, that's about as far as I've advanced with my juggling skills. Mostly because I had no discipline whatsoever for practice. Didn't want to spend time doing it. In my younger days, I got to do it perfectly the first time. I just didn't want to do it. Didn't want to practice in front of a wall like they suggested because that just felt too constricting. This is probably the first time I've picked these up in about 3 years, so that shows you still just how disciplined I am about practicing juggling. But still, I hang on to these, and every once in a while I pull them out, and hopefully I will keep going for a little while. So why am I talking about juggling? First, just so I can make it abundantly clear to anyone here from the IRS that I'm not one of the 500 pastors across the country electioneering in church this morning. 500 pastors across the country talking about their favorite political candidates from the pulpit today because they feel that the limitations on them are an attack on their religious freedom. So I'm not here to talk about politics this morning. But I am here to talk about religious freedom, so I'm grateful to those 500 pastors for the assistance in writing this morning's sermon and giving me such a great example of what it is not. The freedom of religion is probably the value we celebrate the most here in our churches, possibly in our country. It's one of our greatest gifts to this country, one of our greatest legacies. The idea of the freedom of conscience and religion has been with us for hundreds of years. As Deanna told us in the story of King John Sigismund and the Edict of Torda, the first document we have granting religious freedom, the idea had been that you followed the religion of whoever your ruler was until this moment in history where King John gave us the broad choice between Catholicism, Calvinism, and Unitarianism. That was it. The idea's evolved some since then, but that was a pretty big choice for that time. And that idea that your religious choice wasn't tied to your king permeated throughout Europe. Got into the heads of the dissenters in England who decided, yeah, we don't want to practice religion the way our king does. We're getting out of town and going somewhere else where we can have the freedom to practice our religion as our conscience tells us to. And so they came here. And let's be honest, the pilgrims came here pretty much seeking freedom for their religion. They didn't really care much about what your religion might have been. But now the idea was here on these shores, and by the time this brand new country started to form, that notion of freedom was instilled in the hearts and minds of the people and set there in the Constitution. The government cannot establish a religion, and you have the freedom to associate with whoever you wish to as your conscience deems fit. Those are our religious ancestors giving that gift to this country. And the development of the idea of religious freedom didn't just stop there, not just in the form of government, but in how we practice our religion even to this day. In the early 19th century, the Universalist Church adopted what they called the Winchester Confession, a creed, what they believed. But interestingly enough, at the very end of that creed, they tacked on a little out clause for people. These words do not need to be recited in order to be in fellowship with this church. As long as you're in general sympathy with our principles, you can come on in. So there's a creed, but no test to be part of the church. And then here we are today, without a creed at all, merely a set of principles, amongst which are the right for you to search for truth and meaning freely and responsibly on your own. And so here we are today, Unitarian Universalists all across the country, gathering in congregations every Sunday morning, week after week. No two sets of beliefs exactly alike, sitting side by side and getting along in perfect harmony. Don't get ahead of me. Sounds good on paper. Sounds like a marvelous idea. But how are we doing in practice? This past summer, as part of my work with the Commission on Appraisal, we did a hearing at the General Assembly in Charlotte, North Carolina. We had a question and answer period where we asked the questions and the audience got to answer them as we were collecting data for our study on authority and ministry. There were about 125 people in the audience that afternoon. And the question on the table at that point was, where does the source of authority come from in ministry? Everyone had a chance to speak their mind who wanted to get up to the microphone. And one woman got up and spoke at length, not about the question at hand, but about the pain she was feeling as being part of one of our congregations. She held on to pagan beliefs in her church, earth-centered beliefs, and talked at length about how she felt marginalized, hemmed in, restricted from voicing what her conscience told her was true. Now, it had nothing to do with what we were asking in the moment, but the pain was very real. The hurt was tangible. And she had her say and sat down. A few more people got up to speak, and then one young minister got up to answer the question about the source of authority and started talking about her sense of vocation and her sense of call. And she was comfortable enough in her own theology to be able to say that she felt that her call came from God. And as the word God entered the airspace around us in that room, there followed this horrible noise. Everyone get really quiet for a moment. Very strange. Maybe something's wrong with the air conditioning. Okay, we'll let that pass. And the young minister went on talking, and once again, she uttered the word God in her answer, and once again, that sound filled the room. And this is a pretty big room. Okay, this is not a coincidence. Somebody's making this sound. The young minister went on and on, answering the question again, and again the word God was uttered, and again that sound filled the space, and I looked to my left, and sitting 5 seats away from me in my very row was that same woman who earlier talked about her pain of not being accepted and feeling restricted in her beliefs, hissing at someone else, expressing their belief in a God. I have this theory that the universe is powered by giant engines of irony, and we're firing in all cylinders in that moment. This is just one isolated example. Shouldn't necessarily speak to the condition of our congregations across the country, and yet I fear sometimes it may be all too typical an attitude. my freedom. You take care of yourself. This is not just the typical attitude in our congregations. This is a nationwide epidemic. The Pew Research Group that spends its time studying the landscape of religion here in this country and around the world, in their most recent findings just a few months ago, stated that of the people in this country questioned on the topic, 88% felt that there was freedom of religion in this country. To which my first response is, where's the other 12%? But then when we get down to specifics, the number changes. That same group of people questioned when asked about the compatibility of Muslim beliefs with American ideals. Less than half of the respondents felt that there was a correlation there. So 88% of Americans feel there is freedom of religion, but less than half of those people feel it applies to everybody. Now, considering the current cultural and political climate in the country, it's certainly understandable that people might have that attitude. It may just be an aberration. I don't know, until Pew points out that those numbers are pretty much in line with how people responded over previous decades with regards to Catholics and Jews in this country. There is always someone, it seems, whose beliefs we feel just don't fit. We could rightly say that the attitude of the majority of Americans is, I believe that freedom of religion is my inalienable right. I'm not so sure about you, though. Now that's a problem. My universalist heritage teaches me that we're all free, or none of us are. My favorite teacher in high school, in talking about the rights of people, used to illustrate the price of freedom in a very provocative way. My freedom to extend my fist, he would say, ends before it gets to your nose. In other words, there are boundaries to freedom. My freedom can't negate yours, or none of us are really free. And in the realm of religion, it means that I can advocate for my liberty, but I've got to carve out some room in my heart and my mind for your beliefs as well. No matter how strange or alien they may seem, no matter how incompatible they may be with mine, I have to allow your freedom in order to maintain mine. I have to exercise some tolerance.